warfare is changing. We're seeing this whether it's in Ukraine or lots of other places, and that we have to be prepared, right? The 1,000-pound gorilla in the room is AI and the advancements in AI, the applications of AI, and just how quickly technology is changing.
We actually don't have the wherewithal. And there's obviously some underlying, unstated, and definitely classified suggestion that we have some sort of super weapons in the background that we haven't told anybody about.
If you go multiple decades back, almost all of the real innovation happening in the US was driven by R&D budgets out of the government and defense in particular. There is a huge growth in venture-backed companies using commercial best practices to build defense applications, everything from now munitions on down to autonomous vehicles and autonomous ships.
Fascinating things such as applying little drones to fly into buildings so that when the armed forces are considering actually going into that building, they exactly know what's on the inside. I remember once you were giving a talk and the question emerged, how do you feel about your kids serving in the army? And you said, well, if anything, I'd be more worried if they didn't want to.
Welcome to the MacroMashup podcast. I'm your host, Neil Winward. This podcast is sponsored by Dakota Ridge Capital, your energy investments partner, helping developers partner with family offices, banks, corporations to make smart, clean energy deals and maximize government tax incentives.
MacroMashup.
Liz Young McNally. Today on MacroMashup, Liz is joining us. She's a combat veteran, a strategist, a tech leader, shaping innovation at the heart of the U.S. national security. Until recently, stop me if I get this wrong, you were the Deputy Director for Commercial Ops at the Defense Innovation Unit, also known as Unit X, and a book of the same name. And that unit's function was to help bridge Silicon Valley and the Pentagon to strengthen America's technological edge. And before that, you were at Schmidt Futures, and before that, a partner at McKinsey, and before that, you were an officer in the US Army. We're going to explore technology, leadership, and strategy, and how they're redefining economic power and what it means for investors and for America's long-term competitiveness. I think we're going to try and get a sense of your worldview of all this and how that connects to the background of some macro trends and how those interrelate across defense and technology, and find a through line from the Army to McKinsey to Schmidt and to DIU. You don't have to try too hard to get that through line, but I'm sure it will emerge. So as you look at all of these fascinating areas you've been involved in, what are the biggest inflection points right now that you see are shaping America's competitiveness and its sort of competitiveness as a continuing sort of superpower in a more multipolar world?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be with you today and to talk about all these different topics. And I think we truly are at an inflection point, and there's a few different things that are driving it. I think two of the biggest ones are the geopolitical moment that we are in, as well as the technological moment that we are in, quite frankly. The geopolitical moment, number one, I think has helped us realize that there are lots of different types of actors out there. Warfare is changing. We're seeing this whether it's in Ukraine or lots of other places, and that we have to be prepared, right? That we need to have the right types of capabilities to hopefully deter and then also win if forced to fight. And the geopolitical moment that we're in is causing the US to think about that. It's causing Europe to think about that. I think US actions are also causing Europe to think about that. And so you've got a lot of different countries who are thinking about this and taking this much more seriously than they were before. And I think they're also taking much more seriously, and this probably started even during COVID, but the geopolitical moment has continued it. They're really starting to think even more in terms of what do I need to be able to do myself as an individual country versus rely on friends and rely on others for, as you think about manufacturing, supply chain, things like that, really being reshored. So that's the geopolitical moment. And then the technological moment we're in is obviously the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room is AI and the advancements in AI, the applications of AI, and just how quickly technology is changing. Even if we think just in terms of where we were a year ago to where we are now, where we'll be a year from now. So the geopolitics and the technology really driven by AI is causing this moment that we're in.
One of the interesting things, I read that new national security strategy document, which was a very different document from previous iterations of that document. I think a lot of Europeans were freaking out about what that said. And I think one of the things that it's probably unsaid in that document, wisely unsaid, is that one of the reasons why the US is not able to continue to play the role that it has in the past towards Europe is, frankly, we have sort of run out of many of the things that we were supplying for the Ukraine war from our inventory of artillery shells. And we don't actually have the capacity to manufacture a ton of more of those because the Chinese won't let us have all of the rare earth elements that we need to do that. So it's as much as anything, yeah, you need to stand on your own 2 feet, but we actually don't have the wherewithal. We have to keep, and there's obviously some underlying, unstated, and definitely classified suggestion that we have some sort of super weapons in the background that we haven't told anybody about that we're ready to roll out if necessary. And that's the Star Wars Golden Dome strategy sort of thing. But when you think about this through the lens of your time at the Defense Innovation Unit, how does that appear to the Department of Defense? How are they thinking about the way that they integrate cutting edge technology into what they're doing, as opposed to just rolling out another, whatever the class is, Ford class aircraft carrier that they can send down to the Caribbean and threaten Venezuela, but honestly, potentially is more of a liability on the open seas, where you can have relatively cheap drones make a pretty devastating impact on assets like that.
No, absolutely. If we roll back the clock about 10 or so years, a little over a decade ago, I think that was when, under then Defense Secretary, the late Ash Carter, there started to be this real realization among some folks in terms of what commercial technology advances were happening, and that the Defense Department was not taking advantage of those. If you go multiple decades back, almost all of the real innovation happening in the US was driven by R&D budgets out of the government, and defense in particular. And over the ensuing decades, that had evolved, and innovation was being fueled in the US by private capital. And it both wasn't necessarily focused on defense applications, and if there were potential defense applications, the Defense Department wasn't taking advantage of them. And over the last 10 years, there has been a massive shift in terms of all of that. The Defense Innovation Unit and the launch of that was part of it, but there are others in the ecosystem that drove that as well, to the place we are in right now, where there's a tremendous amount of what we would call dual use technology out there, technology that can be applied both for the commercial context, the defense context. There is a huge growth in venture-backed companies using commercial best practices to build defense applications, everything from now munitions on down to autonomous vehicles and autonomous ships and other things to take advantage for the aircraft carrier, a point that you had made earlier. And importantly, there's a massive recognition that the Defense Department also has to change how it engages with the commercial sector, how it becomes easier to work with, how we change the acquisition and other rules to do that. And one thing that I really enjoy about this issue is it's massively bipartisan. Like, in a world in which there are very few things that are, this is a really bipartisan issue. And under the last administration, steps were starting to be taken to get after this issue more seriously. And they have just been supercharged under the Trump administration, as well as by core members of Congress, again, on both sides of the aisle. The National Defense Authorization Act, that I don't think President Trump has signed it quite yet, but it's at his desk and it's been passed by both of those, furthers those reforms to, again, usher in even more commercial technology to help ensure that our military has what it needs to be able to.
Yeah, that's a relatively untalked about piece of legislation that's been moving through Congress. Perhaps not so much talked about because it's so bipartisan, but it's a super important thing that I'm sure he will sign. But it's a very much a kind of a defining moment in where we're stepping off and taking the next steps in terms of our defense strategy. And I'm really fascinated by some of the things that I read in that book, and some of there was a lot of modernization, shall we say, of capabilities that was taking place, just bringing the Defense Department, defense contractors, and the whole contracting process up to a modern day standard, shall we say. But there was also some very fascinating things, such as applying little drones to fly into buildings, so that when the armed forces are considering actually going into that building, they exactly know what's on the inside. And a super important little piece of tech like that, which can definitely save lives, is absolutely crucial, obviously. Did you see a lot of those things taking place at DIU when you were there?
Yeah, so DIU worked across 7 different technology areas where there is commercial technology that we could bring in for the department. So it was everything from AI and autonomy to energy. There's a tremendous amount of work happening in the energy sector that the Defense Department can harness: cyber and telecom, space, human systems. What we talk about is different types of technology that will impact the warfighter, and then emerging technologies like hypersonics and quantum. And then we also did work on advanced manufacturing. So it shows there's a really wide number of types of capabilities that are happening on the commercial side that the Defense Department can bring in. The example you gave is a great one, but we could go down the line in every one of those technology areas and talk about something similar, and that could be equally impactful for the warfighter.
One of the things that's really interesting, I think, is the intersection of the private sector and the Defense Department. Most people, we use Starlink at our home in Colorado, and it's a great technology, but it's a massive deployment of space technology that frankly is incredibly useful for not only civilian purposes, but as we saw in the early days of the Ukraine war, is clearly available for that capability. And so you think about that, that's one private company which is now about to have, I think, about an $800 million valuation when it goes to IPO. And so you think of that, and you think of the other elements of what Musk is pursuing in the robotaxis, but robotaxis obviously is closely connected with humanoid robots, which is a technology which is getting closer. And you can see that there's a company called Corning, which has been around since 1851, based in Corning, New York, and their share price has gone vertical in the last year, in large part because of all of the glass that's needed in fiber to data centers, in the Gorilla Glass for phones, in all of the glass components that humanoids would have across different parts of their humanoid bodies. And the physical reality of those components is incredibly powerful. And we've gone from an era where we think about, oh, software is the key, right? Software and compute. But the reality is that where the rubber meets the road is in the real world of electrons moving from A to B, and the wherewithal, the materials needed to do that, the materials needed to build all of the defense weapons, the energy infrastructure. And so it very quickly, I know that the government has now made, I think, about 14 different equity investments into strategic companies, which is very much of a sort of a Chinese model in some respects. But the intersection of private capital and government capital in this way is really front and center. And I know that's very much on your agenda of things to be thinking about as we move to the next phase. So maybe let's spend a few minutes on that.
No, absolutely. If I take a step back, right, what are the core elements that make the US successful that we need to be able to harness as we think about the moment that we're in? One is clearly our innovation ecosystem, which allows us to continue to build out the types of technologies we've been talking about. The other one is our capital markets, right? Like that, the US is also unrivaled in that, and we need to take advantage of that. I think the first stage of that was this incredible growth of the role of venture capital within defense. But I think we realized, and I spent time thinking about this when I was at DIU, is that venture is necessary but not sufficient, especially for a lot of the more capital intensive efforts. and the efforts where you really need a US demand signal, especially to rebuild something at home. And a number of the different efforts that the administration is taking stakes in are things like that, where it's loans essentially through the Office of Strategic Capital that the Defense Department is making in these companies in order to bring things back to the US and be able to do them here. But I think I'm excited about, yes, there is ventures going to grow, it's going to continue. But what are other sorts of capital that are also going to become even more involved? And this administration is obviously very aggressive in terms of figuring out how does it partner even more with those forms of capital and give the right demand signals in order to do that.
It's a great talking point because there are different points of view on the wisdom of that strategy. One of the usual levers, which the Biden administration was very forceful in promoting through the Inflation Reduction Act, was to create incentives to produce, and especially domestically to produce with domestic union labor, the assets that that we need. So it was tax incentives, and that's great, except it doesn't really go far enough because there aren't really incentives for mining and the harvesting of strategic materials. So this administration has clearly taken an equity capital approach. And if you aggregated the portfolio of assets across the different government departments, you can have quite a sovereign wealth fund there. And if you were to measure those investments in the way that a venture capital fund would measure them, you would have a very good insight as to what kind of impact is being made. But it's certainly a different approach, right? To take equity stakes and to have some form of controlling share in a company. And there's clearly a potential for some abuse, some cronyism. There's a potential for the companies to focus less on their business and their competitiveness and more on making sure that the money continues to flow from government, which doesn't help in the long run. So how are you seeing that playing out?
Look, I think firstly, as you noted yourself, these steps towards some level of industrial policy, right, within the US certainly started actually within the Biden administration, not just with the Inflation Reduction Act, but even more so with the CHIPS Act that they had done. And the Office of Strategic Capital was set up in the previous administration and is now being used for some of the minerals deals that we are so focused on now. To some degree, I think the US government has always played a massive role in this, whether it was also in previous ways and things like DARPA, and they're doing more of it now. I think on the one hand, it's absolutely required, especially in these areas that absent government intervention, we're not going to bring back. And we need to be able to do these things ourselves as opposed to completely relying on other countries such as China to do so in areas like minerals. And it's not going to happen without the government playing a role. The concern, of course, is always, to your point, do you have the incentives right? How good is the US at picking winners? What are the sort of like second and third order effects, the unknown unknowns, in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, that these actions are going to take? And then to what degree, if we have a crystal ball and we go forward 3 years, is the next administration, whoever it is, going to keep them, change them? And what does that whiplash do to these companies? So I feel like we need to do it. We should do it in the places where there is really no other option, because there are all of these other risks associated with doing it, and be really thoughtful as we go about doing that. I know some of the folks who are still serving in government and are trying to think about this, and the folks that I know they're all patriotic Americans on Team America who want what's best for our country. And I think we just have to continue to have them be intentional in terms of how these deals are being structured.
Yeah. Well, I think October, November, the latest non-farm payroll showed finally a lot of those government jobs that were cut through Doge are rolling off. Hopefully those were not jobs in any areas that we care about and that we're thinking about right now. I guess having promised a $2,000 check to everybody, which clearly isn't possible, the $1,700 check that is funded from an appropriation, I'm sure that will be well received by the recipients. So that's a good signal. As you think about the next step, right? I think you're thinking personally about more of a buy-side role, which would be being a part of the private investment community that is participating with the government in these kind of initiatives.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Look, as we've already covered in the show so far, this is just such a exciting moment to be in and a really critical moment for our country. And I think on all the different aspects of the ecosystem, but especially on the sort of funder side, having folks that really understand what it means to have the government as a customer and how that works are critical. And so I'm excited to continue to play a role in the ecosystem from that side.
Right. No, it is an interesting landscape. And I think one of as you participate as the private sector with the government, there are some things you presumably have to wrestle with, which is the ethical position that the administration might take on a number of issues. So presumably you have to get skillful at tuning out some of the partisan discord, which is so present in our daily news flows, such as are you going to release the unexpurgated video of the second strike on the boat off the coast of Venezuela? Those sorts of things are something you presumably have to get skilled at tuning out, because you could find yourself in a position where you're you're asked to make some investment choices, and those investment choices may not, let's say, popular both sides of the aisle. And you may have to recognize that even though you might think one administration versus another is good versus bad, each of those administrations could actually at any point in time be promoting a sensible step, a sensible policy that you have to somehow navigate around any partisan feelings you have to that. So how do you, especially since you served at the pleasure of the commander in chief at the time, how do you think about that? And how do you translate that into the way you approach the private sector investments?
Yeah. Look, I feel very fortunate in that I had 4 years of training in leadership and duty and honor and ethics and everything else at West Point, the US Military Academy, and then another 8 years on active duty, where there were lots of opportunities to reflect and talk about these things in everything from a classroom to on deployment downrange. And one thing that I think is really exciting, again, about the defense technology ecosystem is how many veterans are in it, both within the investor side, but then also running a lot of these defense technology companies. There's a tremendous amount of veterans in them. And there are lots of other ways, I'm sure, at business schools and colleges and lots of other walks of life, there is similar sort of training, but I would posit that the amount of that and the care with which we had it within the military was quite high. And all of us are ultimately serving an oath to protect and support the Constitution of the United States. And I think the military, and that's why you see the veterans, whether it's in Congress or other places, that are more willing to work across the aisle and to think about what's in the best interest of our country first and foremost. So one thing that does give me some modicum of both hope and comfort is the number of veterans across all of these conversations in all these different types of positions that they're in.
And as you go back and you look at each element of the career steps that you've had, right, starting with the Army, just pull out, if you like, the top takeaways and the most valuable takeaways of each of those steps in the process that you bring to this next phase.
Sure. I've had a pretty non-traditional career to date. I think from the Army, I learned fundamentally it's all about people. Like the biggest lesson that you learn in the Army is that you are a servant leader. And if you take care of your soldiers, then you will be able to get the mission accomplished. And so I think that is a leadership trait that I have continued to bring in. The other interesting one I think that you get in the Army in particular is when you become a platoon leader. So your first job as an officer, you're in command of 30 soldiers who have been in the army longer than you, who are like more technical than you, who all of these different pieces. And again, I think you learn a type of leadership in which you're really relying on others, trusting others, being comfortable asking questions, but also being comfortable not being the expert necessarily or the most expert person. And that was something that I learned in the army and have taken with me from McKinsey to Schmidt Futures to Defense Innovation Unit, et cetera. I'm a naturally curious person. And so I think every job I've had is constantly I'm learning new things. But again, relying on that experience, I really forged as a platoon leader in Germany, where you're curious, you're learning, but you're surrounded by other people who are quite frankly better than you are. And then your job is just there to help bring out the best of the team.
Was there ever an turning that position moment that you had when these people look at you and you know they have more experience, but you're the person that they're looking to for a decision? Did you experience that moment?
I don't know if I think back to one specific moment in which did happen. It was probably more of a process than anything. And I think West Point does as much as it can to help prepare you for that. But ultimately, I think those that you're in the privilege of commanding or that you're working with have to know that you have their best interest at heart and that you're willing to do the right thing and you're willing to make hard decisions, to do it in a caring and thoughtful way, but being willing to make those hard decisions. And those are some of the early leadership lessons that I learned.
There's a pretty strong flow out of the armed forces into McKinsey. I think there's a number of people who took that step. Is there a sort of a kinship developed within the McKinsey framework and also in the alum network that you continue to draw upon?
Yeah, look, I think that in many ways, I feel like the Army and McKinsey were very similar organizations. Not many people would probably say that, but have really strong cultures, are more than a job, but less than a life. I think both of them ask that much of you and have a tremendous focus on the person and the individual in each of it. And I spent about as much time in each of those places. And I think they equally shaped me into the leader that I am.
Yeah. I remember once you were giving a talk and the question emerged, how do you feel about your kids serving in the army? And you said, well, if anything, I'd be more worried if they didn't want to.
Yeah.
And which was a surprising answer to me when I heard that. But just unpack that a little bit.
And look, I don't think that it has to be the Army necessarily, just in case they watch this and now suddenly feel that there's higher expectations. But I do think I was raised in a family that has always been very service minded, right? My parents met on the Navajo Indian Reservation when they were both working out there. My dad was a doctor and my mom was a special ed teacher. So I think that's like culture of using your talents to serve others is something that has always been imbued in us. And I hope to imbue the same in my children. The military is one form of how to do that. There are many other forms of how to do, but I think all of us have to really think about what skills do we have and are we using them to the highest use to help continue to make our country and our world a great place to be.
So do you feel confident about the public-private partnership piece of this equation, that's what we've been exploring, really, the movement out of the Army into McKinsey, then into Schmidt and now Defense Innovation Unit. That's clearly a key axis, so to speak, of the world that we're in at the moment. Are you optimistic about that?
How the public and private working together?
Yeah.
Look, again, going back to the first question you had, I think the geopolitical moment that we're in, as well as the technological moments that we are in, have helped make every single CEO and private sector leader the role of government and vice versa. It's always been the case, but now more so than ever. And everything from what Jamie Dimon's doing with his massive commitment around national security and defense, I think we're seeing that across the board. And what we really need is to continue to have people who I think have had experience across both, that have trust in the other, that are able to speak across both languages and assume positive intent across each of them, that we're trying to align incentives across each of those sides.
I think, yes, that there are clearly some folks in the current administration who are doing an amazingly strong job in that. Doug Burgum and the Energy Secretary, who are both extremely competent people. It's not a universally strong team, I think this would be fair to say, but there are definitely elements that give me optimism about the steps that we're taking. So I promise not to keep you very much longer than 30 minutes. So we're coming up on that. And I wanted to get from all of the things that you have seen in the different phases of your career, what, if you imagine for a moment that you were advising somebody in your position who's taking this step, who's going to be on the buy side as an investor, what would you advise such a person to do in terms of filtering out the noise, approaching the whole investment process, looking at the different sectors? What would your advice be to that person who's specifically leveraging your skills and your experience?
I think, in particular, if you're thinking about defense technology, which is the area of it that I know the best, but I'm sure that some aspects of what I'm going to say could be extrapolated to other areas, is to really do your homework and filter out the noise, quite frankly, right? I think that we're seeing an increasing number of firms and individuals wanting to take part, which is great. But you have to really understand what it takes to work with the government, what that process is, what is a real demand signal versus what is not a demand signal. And I think that once you're able to do that, you'll be able to navigate it much better. But it's certainly not for the faint of heart in terms of the work. The government has the potential to be a massive customer, but it's a very complicated customer as well. And the folks that do it best, I think, come in with that humility and really build up that expertise.
And do you think that there are solid investment returns to be had for the private sector in partnering with government?
There absolutely are. And there's also a tremendous amount of venture capital money now, hoping and expecting that to be the case going forward as well. I think the big question is, how quickly will that happen and how much of the defense budget will really shift towards these types of commercially backed companies? But you're certainly seeing now contracts in the hundreds of millions of dollars and more money moving to these venture-backed, commercially focused companies. And the question is just how much more is going to happen. And that's what we're going to need to see in order to see more exits and more, I think, activity and returns, which ultimately is going to be required to keep this ecosystem flourishing.
I think the intersection is an important one, and more we're going to see that the importance of, for example, if you're thinking of putting satellites up, which are going to essentially be data centers in space powered by 24/7 access to the sun, you have to think about who's putting a defense cordon around those assets. If you're thinking about putting things on the moon because the zoning is easier, it is easier until you start thinking maybe there are a few other people that might think about the moon as being their territory as well. So maybe there are some geopolitical zoning discussions that need to take place, right?
Absolutely.
So it's definitely a complicated world. I think we've covered a lot. It feels always somewhat unsatisfying to leave it at this point, but you and I will have more opportunity to discuss this offline. But I wanted to thank you for showing up. I know it's a time commitment. You have a lot of things going on, and I appreciate you showing up. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
No, I'm happy to do it. And thank you for also bringing this topic to your audience, which I know is not just a defense focused audience, but I think this is an important topic for everyone. And so I'm glad to be able to bring it a little bit more broadly too.
Great. Liz, thanks for being on MacroMashup. I will see you soon. Bye-bye.
MacroMashup.